The Harlan County Livestock Exchange smelled the same way it had smelled for 40 years. Animal and grain and the particular sweat of men who worked outdoors in cold weather and came inside only when business required it. Concrete floors worn smooth by decades of boots. Wooden bleachers that creaked under weight. A ceiling high enough to carry sound without breaking it, so that every bid and every comment and every sharp intake of breath traveled the full length of the room before it died. Eleanor Marsh had been coming to this exchange since she was 9 years old, standing beside her father with her hands in her coat pockets, watching him read a room the way other men read a newspaper. Carefully, without rushing, with the understanding that the information was there if you knew where to look and had the patience to look at the right things. She was 58 years old now. Her father had been dead for 3 years. She came alone. It was the 14th of March. Outside, a late Iowa winter was doing what late Iowa winters do, holding on past its welcome, keeping the sky the color of old pewter, pressing down on the landscape with a patience that felt almost deliberate. The county roads were clear, but the fields on both sides of the drive into town had been stripped bare by harvest months ago and had not yet been touched by anything that suggested spring was a real possibility. The tree line along Harlan Creek stood gray and skeletal against the sky. The grain bins on the Hendricks property caught the flat morning light and threw none of it back. Eleanor parked her truck in the far corner of the exchange lot, the way her father always had. He said it kept the doors from getting dinged. She had always thought it was something else, a habit of leaving yourself room to leave quickly if you needed to, the instinct of a man who liked to know his exits before he committed himself to a room. She had never asked him which it was. Now she couldn't. She walked in through the side entrance, nodded to the 2 men she recognized near the door, and found a seat on the 3rd row of the bleachers on the left side. The exchange was already about half full. March auctions drew a working crowd, people who had actual business to transact, not the larger summer auctions that pulled in observers and casual buyers from 3 counties over, who came as much for the atmosphere as for the livestock. Gerald Cutler was there. He was always there. He ran 300 acres of corn and soybeans 10 miles north of the Marsh place, and he had opinions about farming, the way some men have opinions about religion, thoroughly held, freely distributed, and resistant to revision by evidence that arrived in any form other than catastrophic failure. He was 62 years old, and had been working the same ground since he was 25. And he believed this gave him the authority to speak on most agricultural subjects with a confidence that Eleanor had always found more instructive than irritating, because it told her something useful about how most people in this county understood the calendar. He was sitting in the 2nd row with 2 other men she recognized from the county co-op. He saw her come in and gave her a nod that was neighborly without being warm. She returned it in kind and settled into her seat and looked at the lot sheet she had picked up at the door. The auctioneer that morning was a man named Fletcher Dowd, who had been running auctions in Harlan County for going on 23 years. He had developed over those years the particular rhythm that good auctioneers develop, a pace that made each lot feel both efficient and consequential, that gave buyers just enough time to decide without giving them so much time that they started to think too carefully about what they were doing. He moved through the early lots with the ease of a man who had done this so many times that the difficulty had become invisible. Breeding pairs went first, then some early spring feeder stock, then a miscellaneous lot of older laying hens from an operation in the next township that was downsizing. Each lot moved through the room in under 4 minutes. The crowd murmured and bid and occasionally laughed at something Dowd said, and the morning had the comfortable texture of a routine that everyone present understood. Eleanor watched and did not bid. She was waiting. The lot she was waiting for came up 40 minutes into the auction. Fletcher Dowd described it in the flat, factual language he used for all lots: 150 broad-breasted bronze poults, approximately 4 days old, from the Reinhardt operation in Calhoun County. The Reinhardt family had overproduced their spring hatch and was moving the excess before the feed costs ran further ahead of the recovery value. The birds were healthy. They were sexed. They were available for same-day transport. Dowd set his opening bid and looked out at the room. Eleanor raised her hand. Not for a part of the lot. not for a manageable portion that she might work into the margins of her operation without drawing attention. She raised her hand for all of it. 150 birds, the full lot. The room changed. It was not a dramatic change. There was no audible gasp, no sudden silence that fell like a curtain. It was subtler than that, a shift in the quality of attention, the way a room full of people recalibrates when something happens that was outside the morning's expected range. Fletcher Dowd stopped mid-sentence. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at his sheet. He looked at the lot notation again, as if the numbers might have changed since the last time he read them. Then he looked at Eleanor once more, and something in his expression said he was offering her the opportunity to revise her bid downward to something more reasonable if she wanted to take it. She did not take it. From the second row, Gerald Cutler turned in his seat and looked at her directly. He had a broad, weathered face and eyes that were accustomed to squinting against sun and wind and the particular skepticism of a man who had formed strong views about what worked on Iowa farmland and what did not. He said, "It's March, Eleanor." He said it the way you might say it to someone who had announced plans to plant corn in November. Not cruel, not dismissive. The flat delivery of a fact he considered self-evident and that he felt someone needed to say aloud, since apparently no one else was going to. Eleanor did not look at him. She looked at Fletcher Dowd and waited for him to do his job. Dowd recovered the way experienced auctioneers recover quickly because a room full of witnesses was waiting, and his job was to sell what was in front of him regardless of what anyone thought about the buyer. He ran the bid. There was no counter. Eleanor was the only bidder on the full lot. She wrote the check at the table by the east wall. She loaded 150 bronze turkey poults into wire crates in the bed of her truck in the cold March air. The birds made the continuous soft peeping that young poults make, a sound that suggested they had no particular investment in the larger debate about their timing. She secured the crates and drove home on the county road with the heater running and the radio off. 3 men who had been at the auction drove past the marsh place on their way home that afternoon. They all drove slower than the road required. Eleanor's father had built the brooding house in 1963. He had done it himself over 2 summers from salvaged lumber and materials sourced from 3 different places and combined with the particular ingenuity of a man who could not afford to build the same thing twice. The structure was low-roofed and south-facing, positioned to catch the afternoon sun in the months when afternoon sun was something worth planning around. He had insulated it in layers, fiberglass batting in the walls, an additional board insulation layer he added in the mid-1970s after a winter that cost him more in heating than he had budgeted for. The roof had been replaced once in 1988. The electrical had been updated twice. It was in the way of old farm structures built by careful men with limited resources, considerably more sound than it looked from the road. Eleanor had spent 2 weeks preparing it before the auction. Not because she was uncertain about what she intended to purchase. She had been planning this since February and had learned from her father that preparation preceded acquisition, not the other way around. You prepared the space first. You acquired the birds second. That way, when the birds arrived, the only variable was the birds themselves. She had lime-washed the floor, the old practice her father had used throughout his years of operation. A treatment that current veterinary literature still endorsed for its ability to neutralize pathogens without leaving residues that complicated the bird's first weeks. She had laid 4 inches of fresh straw across the entire floor. She had set the brooding circle's low cardboard rings her father had stored folded in the barn rafters for 30 years, still serviceable, designed to keep young poults from wandering away from the heat source into cold corners where they would pile and smother each other in the night. She had hung 8 heat lamps, not the red bulb variety. The infrared bulbs her father had always preferred because the infrared heat penetrated more evenly and did not trigger the pecking aggression that red light could produce in close-quartered birds. She had set the thermometers at 4 inches off the floor. This was the detail her father had been most insistent about in the notebooks and in the conversations she could still recall from childhood, the ones where he had explained things while doing them in the way that people explain things they want someone to remember. Not at standing height, where a person would naturally read a thermometer. At 4 inches, the level where the birds would actually live during their first weeks. The temperature at 4 inches and the temperature at 5 feet were not the same number, and the number that mattered was the one at 4 inches. The one at 5 feet was convenient. The one at 4 inches was real. She had filled the waterers and run the heat cable through the water lines. She had set the feeders at the spacing she had calculated from her father's notes, not from memory or general knowledge, but from the specific figures he had recorded across 22 years of doing this exact thing in this exact building. When the truck came back down the marsh driveway with 150 bronze poults, in wire crates, the brooding house was ready. Eleanor had the birds under the lamps within 40 minutes of arriving home. That night, she opened the wooden box. It was a plain box pine stained dark with age and handling. Her father had made it sometime in the 1970s. She could not remember exactly when, only that it had always been on the bottom shelf of the bookcase in the study to the left of the window, with words painted on the lid in Howard Marsh's careful block lettering, "Turkey Records, Keep." She had found it 3 days after the funeral, when she had come to the house to begin the long, particular work of sorting through a life that had been lived carefully and documented thoroughly. She had opened the box and found 22 composition notebooks inside black and white marbled covers, standard variety, the kind available at any drugstore for $1. The kind a person bought when they intended to fill it and did not need it to look like anything more than it was. Her father had filled all 22. The notebooks ran from 1959, when Howard Marsh had first begun keeping weather notes on the farm, through 2001, the year before his eyesight had deteriorated enough to make close writing difficult. Each notebook covered 1 to 3 years of observation. Each was dated on the spine in the same black ink. Each contained the same categories of information updated throughout whatever period it covered. First hatch dates, purchase dates for poults, brooder, temperatures by week, feed consumption rates, mortality figures by cause and week growth weights at weekly intervals. First frost dates by year, rainfall totals, by month the dates on which commercial operations in the county made their Thanksgiving deliveries, and in the later notebooks the dates on which those deliveries ran short. He had noted everything. He had noted the years when the market behaved as expected and the years when it did not. He had noted why when he could determine it, and he had noted the consequence for his operation. He had noted the years when following the standard calendar was the right decision and the years when it was the wrong one. He had noted in specific and patient detail the years when the calendar failed. Eleanor had read the notebooks 4 times in the 3 years since she had found them. The 4th reading had been this past February, when she had sat at the same desk where her father had written those notes and worked through his records against the conditions she was observing in the present. She had not been looking for confirmation of a plan she had already made. She had been looking for the pattern, the specific combination of conditions that her father had identified across 7 decades of observation as the conditions that created what he called in the 1979 notebook, the gap. She had found it. Tonight, with the brooding house running 40 yards from the back door and 150 poults settled under their lamps, Eleanor opened the 1979 notebook to the November section. Howard Marsh had been 41 years old in 1979. He had been farming this land for 15 years. He had raised turkeys for 12 of those years and had developed the knowledge that comes not from reading about something, but from doing it while paying close attention. He had written in November 1979 sold at premium because the calendar failed everyone else. Commercial operations oversold their processing capacity. 2 of the largest buyers in the county locked in fixed-price contracts in August, and the October frost ran early, and the birds they delivered were underweight, and the restaurants that had ordered from them were left looking for alternatives in the last 10 days of November. I had 40 birds, and I sold every one of them at almost double the price I had expected. The position I was in was not luck. I had been reading the conditions since June. The position was a decision made in March. She had read these words many times. She read them again now slowly in the quiet of the study. Then she opened her own notebook, the 23rd in the series, the first in her own handwriting, and wrote the date at the top of the first page. March 14th, 150 poults acquired. Brooder, running at 95 degrees. Howard's first week average loss 6.3 per 100. We'll see. 3 conditions. That was what her father had identified in the 1979 notebook and in the 3 subsequent years where the same pattern had produced the same outcome. Not 1 condition, not 2. 3 specific conditions occurring together that created the gap between what the market was going to supply and what the market was going to need. The first was feed cost pressure. When commercial turkey feed prices spiked significantly through drought, commodity volatility, supply chain disruption, large commercial operations responded by culling their flocks earlier than planned. Earlier culls meant fewer birds at the processing window. Fewer birds meant a tighter supply heading into November. The second was a disease or disruption event at one or more large commercial facilities. Not necessarily catastrophic, not necessarily front-page news, just significant enough to interrupt production at an operation that the market was counting on, and significant enough that the affected operation could not fully recover its inventory before the Thanksgiving delivery window closed. The third was processing capacity pressure. The large commercial processors operated on fixed schedules booked months in advance with almost no flexibility for late-season adjustments. When commercial operations arrived at the processing window with fewer birds than expected or with birds that had not reached the required weight, the ripple moved forward through the schedule and pushed some deliveries out of the Thanksgiving window entirely into December, where the demand was not. 3 conditions, all 3 present simultaneously. That was the gap. That was the year when a small operation in the right position with birds ready processing, confirmed buyers already identified, could sell at prices the market would not ordinarily produce. Eleanor had spent February identifying each condition for the current year. The feed cost spike had been visible in the commodity reports since the previous autumn. She had read the commodity report every week for 20 years, the way her father had read it, the way a person reads something when they understand it is information rather than simply news. The numbers this year had the same shape as the numbers her father had highlighted in the 1979 notebook and again in 1987 and again in 1993. Not identical numbers. The scale had changed, the specific causes had changed, but the same structural shape, the same relationship between input costs and commercial response. The disease event had been reported in the county extension newsletter in February. Not the county to the south. The county to the north, where 2 of the 3 largest commercial turkey operations in the region were located. The newsletter had used careful language as extension. Newsletters do language designed to inform without alarming, but the information it contained was clear to anyone reading it against the context. Her father's notebooks provided a respiratory illness had moved through one large confinement facility and had required emergency culling of a significant portion of the affected flock. The newsletter noted the affected operation was the 3rd largest single-site turkey producer in a 4-county area. The processing capacity she had confirmed by calling the facility directly and asking, politely professionally as a small producer making preliminary inquiries about scheduling availability. The man she had spoken to was forthcoming because people are forthcoming when you ask clearly and give them no reason to be guarded. He told her the November schedule was already 90% committed, that 2 large operations had been holding multiple date blocks since August of the previous year, that there was very little room remaining for additions. She had thanked him, hung up, and read the 1979 notebook again. Then she had called Fletcher Dowd at the Harlan County Livestock Exchange and asked about the Reinhardt lot. The morning after the auction, Gerald Cutler drove past the Marsh place on his way to the elevator. He had driven past the Marsh farm most mornings for 12 years because the county road was the direct route. He drove past without stopping on most of those mornings. The farm was visible from the road. The main barn, the equipment shed, the house set back from the gate, and driving past it was simply a feature of the commute, unremarkable in the way of things that are always there. He stopped on this particular morning. He got out of his truck and stood on the gravel shoulder and looked at the brooding house. From where he stood, he could hear it, the specific murmur of young poults in adequate conditions, a sound that carries further than most people expect. He recognized it from the years his own father had kept a small turkey operation before deciding the complexity was not worth the margin. Eleanor came out of the house with her morning coffee. She wore a canvas work coat that had been her father's and boots that had seen 4 Iowa winters. She walked toward the brooding house and altered her direction slightly when she saw Cutler at the gate, not to meet him exactly, but to acknowledge him the way farmers acknowledge each other across property lines. Gerald said, "March, Eleanor." He said it the way he had said it at the auction. Not as a question. As a conclusion he had already reached and saw no reason to soften. Eleanor stopped at a distance that was cordial without being inviting. She said, "Good morning, Gerald." He said, "Broad-breasted bronze. 16 weeks minimum to market weight, probably 18 to 20 for the weight you'd actually want. That puts you at July earliest. Nobody wants turkey in July." She said, "I know." He looked at her. He said, "So what's the plan?" She said, "I'm going to grow them." He looked at the brooding house. He looked at her. He said, "That's not a plan." She said, "It's the beginning of one." He stood there a moment longer, with the expression of a man who has run out of useful things to say, but has not yet decided to leave. Then he got back in his truck. He drove to town and stopped at the feed store the way he stopped most mornings. The feed store was run by a man named Arvid Pruitt, who had been selling agricultural supplies in Harlan County for 27 years. He was not a gossip in the ordinary sense. He was something more professionally useful. A man who tracked information because in his business, information about what farmers were buying and doing was a form of inventory. He knew what was happening on most operations within 30 miles before the operations themselves had finished deciding what was happening. Gerald told the story of the auction. Arvid listened. 2 other farmers waiting for a delivery listened without appearing to. Arvid said March. Gerald said March. Arvid said, "Howard Marsh used to raise turkeys." Gerald said, "Howard Marsh knew what he was doing." A pause settled into the room. One of the other farmers, an older man named Raymond Voss, 74 years old, who had farmed in Harlan County for longer than anyone else present and who was not in the habit of volunteering opinions to people who had not asked for them, sat in the corner with his coffee and said nothing. Gerald left. Arvid served the next customer. The morning moved on. But the conversation about Eleanor Marsh and the 150 March Polts did not quite leave the feed store that day. It returned through the morning between other conversations, the way a thing returns when it has not been settled, when the available evidence is not yet sufficient to reach a conclusion that everyone present is comfortable committing to. Nora Deming came by that afternoon. She lived a mile south on a property she had farmed with her husband until his death 6 years ago and had continued farming alone since smaller scale, now focused on the market garden and the laying flock, but still, they're still rooted in the way of neighbors who have known each other for a long time. She and Eleanor had been neighbors for 30 years and did not require pretexts for visits. She brought a casserole and set it on the kitchen counter and poured herself coffee without being asked which was the custom between them. She said, "People are talking." Eleanor was at the kitchen table with the 1979 notebook open in front of her, the February extension newsletter beside it, and a yellow legal pad covered in her own notes. She did not close the notebook. She said, "I know." Nora sat across from her. She looked at the notebooks and the newsletter and the legal pad. She had the expression of a woman who had known Eleanor Marsh for 3 decades and had learned to read what Eleanor was doing from what Eleanor was looking at, rather than from what Eleanor was saying. She said, "Gerald Cutler was at Arvid's store this morning." Eleanor said, "I know he was." Nora said, "There's something beyond the auction talk. Gerald has been speaking with a land investor from Des Moines, someone who has been asking about available parcels in the county." She paused. "Gerald told this man that the South 50 of the Marsh place might be worth looking at." She said it carefully, the way you say something careful to someone you have known for 30 years and whose reaction you cannot fully predict. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She said, "The South 50 is not available." Nora said, "I told Arvid that, but Gerald seems to believe the situation might look different to you by autumn." Another pause. He told Arvid he was trying to help, that a woman managing a place this size alone shouldn't have to carry it all, that the South 50 would give you capital to make the rest of the operation more manageable. Eleanor looked at the legal pad. She looked at the extension newsletter. She looked at the 1979 notebook. She said quietly, "The South 50 has the brooding house on it." Nora said, "I know." The silence between them was the comfortable kind, not the absence of communication, but a different register of it available only between people who had known each other long enough to have earned it. Eleanor said, "Gerald is working from the calendar. The calendar says a March start on turkeys is a mistake. He's projecting forward from that. If the birds don't sell, I'll need capital by autumn. He thinks he's being a good neighbor." Nora said, "Is he wrong about the calendar?" Eleanor said, "The calendar is a tool. It describes what usually happens. It doesn't account for the years when what usually happens doesn't." She turned a page in the legal pad. "My father built 22 years of records around exactly this question: when does the calendar fail, and who is in the right position when it does?" Nora looked at the notebooks in the open box on the shelf. She had known Howard Marsh for many years and had always understood in the vague way of neighbors that he was a careful man who kept good records. She had not known until this moment the specific shape of what those records contained. She said, "And this year, the calendar fails." Eleanor said, "If the three conditions hold yes." Nora said, "What are you going to do about Gerald and the investor?" Eleanor said, "Nothing. I'm going to grow my birds." Nora looked at her for a long moment. She said, "Your father answered questions that way. You'd ask him something direct, and he'd tell you the next thing he was going to do, which wasn't quite the same as answering the question." Eleanor said, "I learned it from him." Nora picked up her coffee. She said, "He was right more often than not." Eleanor said, "He was right about the things he'd taken the trouble to understand." After Nora left, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table for another 2 hours. She was not thinking about Gerald Cutler or the investor from Des Moines. She was working through the calculation her father had made in the 1979 notebook. The relationship between feed cost per bird per week at each development stage, the processing cost per bird, the expected market weight, and the price the market would produce in a year when the three conditions created the gap. She did the calculation in her own numbers, updated for the current year. The structure was her father's. The arithmetic was her own. When she finished, she wrote at the bottom of the page, "If the three conditions hold, the margin justifies the timeline. If they do not hold, I will have spent a season on a careful mistake. Howard accepted this risk in 1979. I accept it now." She closed the notebook. Outside, the brooding house was running. 150 pulse in the warm dark at 4 inches from the floor, where the temperature was what she needed it to be. Tomorrow she would check them at 4 in the morning, and at dawn, and at noon, and at dusk. She would do this every day for the next 3 weeks. She would write down everything. She would read what was behind the calendar. And in November, when the commercial operations that had followed the standard calendar found themselves short, when the processing slots were full and the restaurants were searching, she would be ready. The brooding house hummed steadily in the early Iowa dark. 150 birds, the beginning of a record she would keep forward. The first 3 weeks were the weeks her father had called the deciding weeks. He had written it in the 1968 notebook in the section on early brooding management in the particular deliberate way. He wrote things he considered essential, not underlined, not starred, just written more slowly. The letters slightly larger than his usual hand, as if the care of the writing itself was a form of emphasis. The first 3 weeks decide the flock. What you do in the first 3 weeks determines what you have in the 20th week. No management decision you make after week 3 carries the same weight as the decisions you make in weeks 1 through 3. The flock you have at Thanksgiving is built in March. Eleanor had read this sentence many times. She understood it the way you understand something confirmed by experience rather than simply absorbed from instruction. She checked the brooding house at 4 in the afternoon on the day the birds arrived, and again at 8 in the evening. She set her alarm for 2 in the morning and checked again, then moving through the dark with a flashlight reading the thermometers at 4 inches, watching how the birds distributed themselves under the lamps. Distribution was the reliable indicator. Her father had written it clearly across several different notebooks in the way he wrote things he had confirmed from multiple seasons. You can read a thermometer and trust it or distrust it, but the birds will always tell you the truth. Birds spread evenly across the brooding circle indicated the temperature was correct. Birds huddled tight beneath the center of the lamp meant they were cold. Birds pressed to the edges of the cardboard ring meant they were too warm. The birds were a thermometer that could not malfunction if you understood how to read them. At 2 in the morning on March 14th, the birds were spread evenly. She adjusted one lamp, the third, from the east wall, which was reading a half-degree cooler at bird level than the others, raising it slightly and checking again after 20 minutes. When the distribution held steady, she went back to the house and slept until 5:30. She did this every day for the first week. 4 checks daily, the last one at 2 in the morning. She slept in segments, 4 hours before the midnight check, 2 hours after. It was not comfortable. It was also not difficult in the way that difficult things are difficult when you are unprepared for them. She had known this was what the first week required. Her father had written it plainly. She had planned her sleep schedule around it the way you plan around any known requirement, and knowing it was coming made it something to execute rather than something to endure. On the 8th day, she slept through to 4 in the morning. On the 10th, she slept until 5. By the end of the 3rd week, she was sleeping normally. The birds were eating and drinking and growing and doing what bronze turkey poults do in adequate conditions, which is everything their genetics inclined them toward at the steady and reliable pace of things that are simply working as designed. She lost 4 birds in the first 3 weeks. 1 in the first week, a bird that had been marginal from the start. The kind of individual animal that her father's notebooks described with specific language across multiple entries, the bird that does not thrive, regardless of conditions, that consumes resources without returning them, that should be removed early before it becomes a more complicated problem. She removed it on day 4. She wrote in the notebook, March 18th. 1 bird removed failure to thrive. Not a management error. 2. In the 2nd week, an early respiratory presentation she caught in time to isolate before it could spread. She treated the water in the brooding area with the additive her father had used, an old preparation that current literature still endorsed, and watched the remaining birds for 3 days afterward. Nothing developed. She wrote March 22nd. 2 birds' early respiratory presentation isolated immediately. Water treated. No further indication. 1 in the 3rd week. A lamp came loose from its mount during a night when the wind was high, and the building shook more than usual, and by the time she checked at 2 in the morning, the temperature in the corner beneath it had dropped. The bird nearest that corner had not moved to compensate. She found it at dawn. She wrote March 29th. 1 bird cold exposure lamp displacement, remounted all lamps, added secondary clip to each fixture. This will not happen the same way again. 4 birds in 3 weeks. 2 7/10 per 100. Her father's average across 22 years was 6.3 per 100. She looked at the number when she wrote it. Then she closed the notebook and went to check the water levels in the brooding house because the water levels needed checking, and that was the next task on the list, and the list did not pause for reflection. April came and the county planted corn and talked about Eleanor Marsh's turkeys. Not because the turkeys were more interesting than the corn planting. The corn was the primary subject at the feed store and the elevator and the diner on the main street of town, as it was every April. But Eleanor's turkeys moved through those conversations as a recurring reference point, because Eleanor was not planting corn this spring. She had leased her tillable acres to a neighbor on a cash rental arrangement, the same her father had used in his last years. And what Eleanor was doing instead with her spring invited the kind of ongoing commentary that things invite when they deviate from the established pattern of what people in a community do and how they do it. Gerald Cutler remained the most consistent voice in that commentary. He had not revised his position since the morning he stood at Eleanor's gate and delivered his assessment. The timing was wrong. The birds would not be at market weight before July. The feed cost of carrying 150 turkeys from March to Thanksgiving was substantial. The commercial operations would satisfy the November market before Eleanor's birds were in a position to compete. All of this was accurate as far as it went. What it did not account for was that Eleanor was not planning to compete with the commercial operations. She was planning to be present in the gap that appeared in certain years when the commercial operations' own calendar failed them. She was not trying to outrun the commercial supply. She was planning to be ready in the space the commercial supply could not fill. This distinction was not visible from outside the marsh operation in April. It would not become visible until November. And so the commentary continued, and Eleanor let it continue, because explaining it would have required making her analysis public, and her analysis was in the notebooks and on the legal pad, and not anywhere else. Nora Deming came to help move the birds to the outdoor range area in the second week of April. The birds were 8 weeks old, and had outgrown the brooding circles and the interior setup, and were ready for the transition to the fenced range section on the south field. The two women worked together in the early morning before the heat of the day arrived, moving birds through the transfer crates from the brooding house to the range methodically without hurrying. The range area was fenced on 4 sides. It faced morning sun and caught afternoon shade from the woodlot on the east. The windbreak on the northwest corner, a double row of white pine her father had planted in 1971. Specifically for this purpose, because he had learned in the 1960s that birds on the unprotected side of a field in October, where birds fighting the weather instead of gaining weight, stood solid and dense, doing the work it had been planted to do 53 years earlier. While they worked, Nora said, "Gerald hasn't mentioned the Des Moines investor in a few days, according to Arvid." Eleanor passed a transfer crate through the gate and latched it. She said, "He's waiting to see what happens in the fall. He thinks by October I'll know the birds didn't sell and I'll be more receptive." Nora said, "And will you be?" Eleanor said, "By October the birds will have sold, or they will be sold, or I will know they will sell." Nora looked at the crate she was holding. She said, "That's 3 different things." Eleanor said, "They all lead to the same result for the South 50. They worked in silence for a while. The morning was cool and clear. The kind of April morning Iowa offers occasionally as evidence that it knows how to be pleasant when it chooses. The birds moved into the range area with the particular tentative energy of young animals encountering space for the first time, spreading outward from the transfer point and then pulling back, and then spreading again, gradually mapping the ground. Nora said, "Your father used to raise birds in odd months, some years not every year." Eleanor said, "He did it 4 times that I can document. 3 of those 4 years were years when the commercial supply ran short in November." Nora looked at her. "The 4th year," Eleanor said, "he made a mistake in his reading of the conditions. He noted it in the notebook. He described what he missed and why and how he would read it differently the next time." Nora said, "Did he?" Eleanor said, "He raised birds in odd months 3 more times after that year. He was right all 3 times." Nora handed another bird through the gate. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How many do you have placed so far?" Eleanor said, "1 confirmed, 149 to place." Nora did not say anything to that. She went back to moving birds. Eleanor appreciated this about her, that she knew when a number was a number and not an invitation to comment. In May, Eleanor made 4 phone calls. She had marked the calls in February as part of the plan. The specific outreach sequence her father's notebooks described obliquely across several years of records. Howard Marsh had never written a marketing strategy. He had written observations. Eleanor had read the observations enough times to understand the strategy they implied, the way you can read a set of field notes long enough to understand the hypothesis the person was testing, even if they never stated it directly. She made the calls on a Tuesday morning from the kitchen table with the 23rd notebook open in front of her. The first call was to Silas Boone. Silas ran the custom processing facility 12 miles north of town. He was in his early 60s, compact and deliberate in his manner, the kind of man who had done skilled work long enough that the skill had become indistinguishable from his general way of being in the world. He remembered Howard Marsh without prompting. Eleanor told him who she was, what she had, and what her timeline was. She told him she was looking at the week of November 18th as her primary processing window, with the week of the 11th as a backup. She told him her projected volume approximately 138 birds, assuming normal seasonal mortality from her current count of 146. Silas was quiet for a moment. He said he had capacity in that window and asked her to call back in September to confirm. Eleanor said, "Mr. Boone, I'd prefer to book the dates now. Confirmed, not tentative." Another pause. He said, "Most producers wait until they know their final numbers." She said, "I know my numbers well enough for a confirmed booking, and I'd rather not be calling in October to find the window is closed." He was quiet again. Then he said, "Your father used to call in May." She said, "I know." He put her on the schedule. Confirmed. Week of November 18th, back up the 11th. She wrote in the notebook May 6th. Processing confirmed Boone facility. Week of November 18th. Back up November 11th. This is done. 6 months from now, this will matter. The second call was to Harlan Fresh Market, the small independent grocery, in the county seat that her father's notebooks mentioned 3 times across different years as a buyer of locally raised Thanksgiving turkeys. The contact name her father had recorded was 20 years old, and the man who answered was not that person, but the store was the same store. After Eleanor explained who she was and what she was calling about, he confirmed that yes, they still sourced local birds when they could, and yes, they were interested, and yes. And this was the detail her father had underlined: call in September, not October. October was too late for them to rearrange their inventory orders. The decision was made in September. Eleanor thanked him and wrote Harlan Fresh Market call, September 8th. Do not wait until October. The third call was to a restaurant called Elm and Stone in the county seat. She had identified it from months of reading the local paper's food coverage, a restaurant that had been making deliberate choices about local sourcing, that had mentioned specific farms by name in the paper, that had the profile of a buyer who would pay a premium price for a product with a story attached to it. She reached the chef, who was also one of the owners. He was in his mid-30s and attentive in the focused way of people who have built something they care about and are always interested in meeting people who share the same seriousness about their own work. He wanted to know about the birds, breed feed program, range conditions, processing facility. Eleanor told him plainly, and he listened without interrupting. He said he was interested and asked her to call in August to discuss specifics. She wrote Elm and Stone call August 4th. Do not miss this date. The fourth call was to a family named Kettridge, whom she knew through her daughter's years in 4-H. They raised much of their own food on a small property east of town, and the woman of the house had mentioned at a county fair 3 years ago that they had not been able to find a good local turkey for Thanksgiving in years. Her father had written in a notebook from the early 1980s, "The most reliable buyer is the one who already wants what you have before you call them." The Kettridge family said yes before Eleanor finished her sentence. She wrote, Kettridge family, 1 bird confirmed, 149 to place. She put down the pen and went to the range for the afternoon check, because the afternoon check was due and the birds were the work. And the work did not adjust its schedule for the completion of phone calls. The crisis came on the night of May 14th. She had not been expecting this specific crisis, but her father had written in the 1971 notebook, "A season without a crisis is a season that has not yet finished." The useful response to this is not anxiety. The useful response is preparation. She had replaced the lamp bulbs in January. She had added the secondary clips to the lamp fixtures after the March incident. She had run a spare electrical line from the main barn to the brooding house as a backup circuit, a step her father had recommended in a note she had initially read as optional and then reread and understood as something else. She had installed the backup circuit in February. The preparation was what made the difference. She woke at 2:15 in the morning, not from the alarm, which was set for 2:30, but from something she could not name precisely, the kind of waking that happens when something in the peripheral awareness has registered a change before the conscious mind has fully engaged. She lay still for 3 seconds. Then she got up. She put on her boots and coat and took the flashlight and walked the 40 yards to the brooding house in the dark. The east section was wrong before she opened the door. The quality of sound coming from that end of the building was different from the usual settled murmur of birds in adequate warmth, slightly higher in register, slightly more agitated the sound of birds that were not where they wanted to be. She opened the door and swept the flashlight and saw it immediately. Lamps 3 and 4 on the east side were dark. The wire housing on lamp 3 showed a scorched mark at the connection point. A circuit failure, not a bulb failure. The birds in the east section had been compensating for the heat loss for some time. A cluster of 20 had drawn together near the single functioning lamp remaining on that side, pressed close in the way that birds press close when the ambient temperature has dropped below what they can maintain individually. She checked the thermometer at 4 inches in the east section. 68 degrees Fahrenheit. The birds needed 75 minimum at this stage. The gap between 68 and 75 was the gap between adequate and dangerous for birds at 9 weeks. She did not calculate how long the section had been cold. She moved. The equipment cabinet on the west wall held 2 spare lamps she had stored there in January. She pulled both and ran the extension cord from the backup circuit, the one she had installed in February, to the east section. She hung the first spare lamp and plugged it in and watched it begin to glow. She hung the second lamp beside it, offset to cover the full area. She went to the barn and came back with 2 heavy wool blankets and rigged them along the east wall as a temporary barrier, buying the recovering section time to warm before the heat escaped through the boards. She worked without stopping for 2 hours and 40 minutes. At 4:50 in the morning, the temperature in the east section was back to 72 degrees and climbing. The cluster of birds had loosened. Some had moved toward the newly lit lamps. She walked the section slowly with the flashlight low, reading each bird the way her father had taught her, not looking for the obviously sick ones, looking for the ones whose posture had shifted in the small ways that preceded the more visible decline. The slight drop in the head angle, the decreased tendency to move toward the feeder, the particular stillness that was different from resting. She found 2. She moved them to the warmest corner near the functioning lamps and stayed with them. She went to the house and got the water additive her father had recommended for cold stress situations and added it to the east section waterers. She came back and sat with the 2 birds in the recovering warmth of the east section for another 30 minutes. By 6 in the morning, one of the 2 had recovered well enough to move toward the feeder under its own direction. The other had not. She waited another 20 minutes watching. Then she made the decision clearly, because the decision was clear and dealt with it in the way her father had dealt with things that needed dealing with quickly, without prolonging it, because prolonging it served no purpose that she could defend. She opened the notebook in the morning light of the brooding house and wrote May 15th. Lamp failure east section. Circuit fault at lamp 3 connection. 2 spare lamps deployed, backup circuit used, backup circuit installed. February the 12th. Worked exactly as intended. Temperature in east section dropped to 68 degrees before discovery. Approximate exposure window unknown. Lost 2 birds to cold exposure. Total season loss to date 6 birds. Still below Howard's first quarter average of 6.3 per 100. Fault. I was not running a midnight check between the 2 a.m. and 5:30 a.m. rounds. A midnight check would have caught this earlier. Beginning midnight checks tonight through end of May. She looked at what she had written for a moment. Then she added 1 line below it. The backup circuit worked. The preparation was right. The scheduling of checks was wrong. Won't happen the same way again. She closed the notebook. She went inside, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table for 15 minutes with the cup in her hands, and looked out the window at the brooding house. Then she went back to begin the morning feeding round because it was 7 o'clock and the morning feeding round was an hour overdue, and the birds needed it. There was a list of things that needed doing. She started at the top and worked through it. June came and the birds moved fully into the range area. They were 12 weeks old, and the change in them from March was the change that always surprised people who had not watched it happen before the transformation from the small, almost fragile creatures of the brooding house into the upright, substantial animals of the range. The broad chest was filling out, The plumage was shifting from the mottled juvenile pattern into the adult bronze that caught morning light differently from anything else in the yard. They moved across the range area with the unhurried confidence of animals that had been given adequate space and were beginning to understand what space was for. Eleanor walked the range every morning at 5:30. She walked it the way her father had described walking it, the way she had read about in the notebooks, many times, not checking for specific things, not moving toward a predetermined target, but moving through the space slowly and letting her eye catch what was different before her mind decided what to do about it. The birds that were not covering ground at the normal pace. The birds whose posture had shifted in the small ways that preceded the more visible signs. The birds that were eating without drinking or positioned away from the flock with a quality of stillness that was not resting. She pulled 3 birds in June. 2 showed the early respiratory indicators. The slight angle change in the head carriage, the reduced range movement that her father had noted in the 1975 notebook as the first visible signs before the audible symptoms developed. She isolated them immediately and treated the water in the main range area. The remaining birds showed nothing. She watched them for 5 days to be sure. 1 bird she pulled because it was not gaining at the rate of the others, the kind of individual animal that will not close the gap, regardless of conditions that her father had described with practical precision. Remove it early. The resources you spend trying to bring it along are resources the productive birds need. She wrote at the end of June. June 30th. 144 birds in range. 3 pulled this month. Feed consumption on track. Range grass in good condition. No disease events in the main flock. Total season loss, 9 birds, 6.0%. Howard's full season average was 13%. On pace. She wrote the number. She did not write anything beyond the number. In July, Raymond Voss came to the Marsh place without calling first. He drove an old pickup that ran through a combination of mechanical stubbornness and the specific understanding that old farmers develop with old machines, not affection, but a working relationship between 2 things that have depended on each other long enough that dependence has become its own kind of reliability. He pulled into the yard on a Tuesday afternoon in the 2nd week of July when the birds were 16 weeks old. He got out of the truck and walked to the range fence and looked at the birds for a long time without saying anything. Eleanor came out of the barn and crossed the yard and stood beside him at the fence. The birds at 16 weeks were a different thing from the birds of April. The weight was visible in them now, not heaviness exactly, but substance, the settled physical presence of animals that had completed a significant portion of their development and were now building on a foundation that was established. The plumage caught the July afternoon light and held it in the specific way that bronze plumage holds light shifting between copper and dark gold as the birds moved. Raymond Voss said, "Your father's birds always stood like that at 16 weeks. Eleanor said, "He kept specific notes on what 16 weeks looked like, what the weight distribution should be, what the plumage development should indicate." Voss was quiet for a moment. He had the stillness of old men who have learned over many years that most of what they want to say has already been said elsewhere, and that what remains unsaid is usually worth waiting for the right moment to say. He said, "Did you find the 1979 notebook?" She looked at him. He said, "Howard told me once he was going to write it all down. Everything we worked through together that year. He said he was going to put it in the record so it wasn't lost when he was gone." She said, "It's there, November section. He described the whole season." Voss nodded slowly. He kept looking at the birds. He said, "That year we were the only 2 operations in the county who read what was coming. Howard had been watching the feed prices since June. I had been watching the processing schedule. I knew one of the large operations was already overbooked because I had tried to add a November slot in August and been told there was nothing left. 2 producers, both in the right position birds, ready when nobody else had birds that were ready." He paused. He said, "I sold 40 birds in November of 1979 at a price I had never seen before and have not seen since in 45 years of farming this county. Howard sold more than I did because he always ran more birds than I did. We both cleared margins that justified everything we had spent since March." Eleanor said, "He never told me that directly, not in conversation. Voss said. He figured you'd find it in the records. He always said the records were more reliable than the conversations. Conversations, he said, you remember the way you want to remember them. The records, you read the way they are. She was quiet for a moment. Voss said, "This year looks like 1979 to me." She said, "I know, I've been reading it the same way since February." He looked at the birds one more time. Then he looked at the windbreak on the northwest corner, the white pines Howard had planted in 1971. He said, he planted those for the birds. She said, northwest prevailing wind in October. He noted it in the 60s, planted the break the first chance he had the capital for it. Voss said, he thought ahead. Eleanor said, he wrote it down so he didn't have to rely on thinking ahead in the moment. The thinking ahead was already done. The records just kept it available. Voss got back in his truck. He drove down the driveway and turned onto the county road and was gone. Eleanor stood at the range fence for a moment after the sound of his engine faded, looking at the birds. Then she went inside and opened the 23rd notebook to the July section and wrote July 11th. Voss visited. He and Howard were the two operations that correctly read 1979. He confirms that this year presents the same conditions. This is now confirmed from two independent readings of the same data, his from direct experience in 1979, mine from the records. The analysis holds. She closed the notebook and went back to the afternoon check. The predation event came in the third week of July. She found the evidence at the southwest corner of the range fence on a Thursday morning, disturbed ground along the fence line, a gap in the bottom wire where something had pressed through during the night, 2 birds missing from the morning count. She repaired the fence the same morning, additional wire staples along the full southwest, run a second strand at ground level, a board brace at the corner post where the gap had been. She found the missing birds at the edge of the woodlot and dealt with what she found. She wrote July 21st. Predation event, southwest corner. Gap at bottom wire. Corner post. 2 birds lost. Fence repaired same morning, full southwest run restaked, and second strand added at ground level. Total season loss 11 birds, 7.3%. Howard's full season average 13%. Still on pace. She had 139 birds at the end of July. The math for the placement she had done in May was based on an expected flock of 137 to 140 at processing. 11 losses through July was within the range she had planned for. The numbers were holding. August 4th, the call to elm and stone. She had written the date in February. She had circled it on the page. She had written it again in May after speaking with the chef. She dialed at 9 in the morning on the 4th before other work began, because this call was the morning's priority, and priorities were addressed in order of importance, not convenience. The chef answered on the 3rd ring. He had been thinking about their May conversation more than he had expected, he said. He had spoken with some of his current suppliers about local sourcing and had found, as he had suspected, that the genuinely local options in the region were more limited than the general conversation about local food suggested. He wanted details, specifically the processing facility, the full feed program, the range conditions. Eleanor told him. She described the range setup, the windbreak, the feed program her father had developed, and she had continued. She told him about Silas Boone and the dates she had confirmed in May, and the specific reason she had booked in May rather than waiting. He was quiet for a moment after that last detail. He said, "You booked processing in May." She said, "May 6th. Another pause. He said, "I have been trying to find a reliable processing source for local birds for 3 years. Every fall, the answer is the same." Eleanor said, "The schedule fills early. Most producers don't call early enough." He said, "What weight range are you projecting?" She told him the expected processing weight for broad-breasted bronze at 22 weeks on a full-range program taken directly from her father's records for the same breed at the same stage. He said, "I'd want 18 birds, fresh, not frozen, delivery or pickup within 48 hours of processing." She said, "I can do that." He said, "What price?" She named it. The price she had calculated in February based on the cost structure of the operation and the market position she was describing on the commercial price, which reflected industrial scale. But the price that reflected what these birds were and what it had taken to produce them. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "That's significantly above commercial." She said yes. He said, "What do I tell my customers about the difference?" She said, "You tell them the birds were raised on open range from mid-March. Natural feed program, processed fresh at a local facility that has been operating in this county for over 20 years. You can tell them the name of this farm, and they can drive past it on the county road on the way to dinner." He was quiet again, but differently, not calculating, deciding. He said, "All right, 18 birds, week of November 18th, fresh delivery." She wrote August 4th. Elm and Stone confirmed. 18 birds at my price. Total placed 19 birds. 118 remaining. She put the pen down and looked at the number. 118 birds still to place. A large number. But September was the month the market moved, and September was coming, and she had what she needed to meet it. Processing confirmed pricing established the first buyer in place as a reference point for every conversation that followed. She made a note to call Harlan Fresh Market on September the 8th, exactly as she had marked it in February. Then she went to the range for the morning walk because it was 9:30 and the morning walk was overdue. September arrived with a change in the light that was particular to Iowa in that month, lower, more angular. The kind of light that makes familiar things look more substantial than they did in summer. As if the season itself were drawing attention to what was worth keeping. The birds were 24 weeks old. Eleanor walked the range at 5:30 every morning, and what she saw each morning was the flock she had built from March, 139 birds, at 24 weeks in full range condition, carrying the weight and health that 24 weeks of consistent management produced. The bronze plumage had fully developed. The birds moved across the ground with the settled, purposeful gait of animals that had arrived at what they were going to be. She called Harlan Fresh Market on September 8th. The buyer was in on Tuesday mornings, and this was a Tuesday, and he remembered her spring call and said he had been half expecting to hear from her. She told him what she had. She told him the processing dates confirmed with Silas Boone in May. She offered him 30 birds in the mid-range weight class, 12 to 16 pounds, the range that worked for retail display, and the family of 8 buyer who wanted 1 bird and cared about size. He said, "What price?" She named it. He said, "That's higher than the local birds we sourced last year." She said, "Supply is tighter than last year." He said, "How do you know that?" She said, "The September Extension newsletter. 2 of the large operations in the county north are running late on processing. Their November inventory will arrive in December." He was quiet. She waited. He said, "I'll take 25. She wrote September 8th. Harlan Fresh Market. 25 birds at my price. Total, placed 44 birds. 93 remaining. She called Silas Boone and updated him on the confirmed volume. He said he'd had 3 other operations call him in the previous 10 days asking about emergency processing availability in November. He had told all 3 that his schedule was full. Eleanor thanked him and wrote, below the Boone note, processing confirmed against growing market shortage. Emergency requests already appearing. The gap is opening as projected. She made a note at the bottom of the September page, call Kettridge family. Ask who they know. She called Margaret Kettridge the following morning. Margaret said yes to their own bird, and yes, she had mentioned Eleanor's operation to 3 families at the school board meeting the previous week. 2 of those families confirmed the same day Eleanor called them. The 3rd asked to call back in October. Eleanor marked the date and called back in October, and that family confirmed also. By the end of September, she had 72 birds placed and 67 remaining. October moved through the county with the seriousness of purpose that the harvest season demands, the combines running from first light to last. The roads carrying the traffic of a county in the most consequential weeks of its agricultural year. The corn came in. The beans followed. The fields went from standing crops to worked ground in the compressed, urgent rhythm of harvest, where weather is the variable, No one controls, and pace is the response to everything it might do. Eleanor watched the harvest from the range fence in the evenings because the range fence was where her work was. And her work was the birds, and the birds required the morning and afternoon walks, and the weekly weight assessments, and the water, and the feed, and the daily accounting of what she had and what she needed. She had 67 birds to place at the start of October. She worked through a list she had been building since September, the catering company she had learned about through the chef at Elm and Stone, who had mentioned it in passing. A newer restaurant in town that had started a local sourcing program over the summer. The small hotel on the East County Road that ran a Thanksgiving dinner for its guests and had been trying to source locally for 3 years without consistent success. She called the catering company on October the 3rd. The owner was a woman named Patrice Elliman, who ran Harlan events out of the county seat. She had been in the catering business for 20 years and had the practical intelligence of a person who has spent 2 decades solving the same recurring problem, finding reliable quality product at predictable volume, and has learned exactly what to ask to avoid being disappointed again. Her questions were specific and in the right order. She asked about processing first. Eleanor told her Silas Boone, confirmed since May 6th. Patrice said, "You booked processing in May." Eleanor said May 6th. A pause with a particular quality. Patrice said, "I have been trying to secure November processing slots for my Thanksgiving events for 4 straight years. Every September, the answer is the same: the schedule is full." Eleanor said, "It feels early. Most producers don't call early enough." Patrice said, "How many birds do you have available?" Eleanor said she could offer 12, the larger weight class, 18 to 22 pounds. The birds that worked for whole bird presentation at the kind of event Harlan events ran. Patrice said, "What price?" Eleanor told her. The same price she had quoted everyone. Patrice said, "That's above commercial rate." Eleanor said, "Yes, the same answer I give everyone who asks that these are not commercial birds." Patrice said, "All right." She said it immediately without the pause that indicated recalculation. 12 birds week of November 18th fresh. Eleanor wrote October the 3rd. Harlan Events Catering. 12 birds. Total placed 56 birds. 83 remaining. She called the second restaurant on October the 5th and placed 8 birds. She called the hotel on October 8th and placed 11 more. She worked through the remainder of her list steadily across the month, following up on every referral the Kettridge family had generated, calling back everyone she had marked as a pending contact, confirming each placement in the notebook the same day it was made. By the 3rd week of October, she had 109 birds placed and 30 remaining. At the feed store in the last week of October, Raymond Voss stood at the counter and said to Arvid Pruitt, "Eleanor Marsh has good birds." He said it as an observation in the way he said most things, not as a prediction, not as a challenge, not as a correction of anyone's stated position, as a fact he had verified and considered worth stating. He had driven past the Marsh place the previous week and seen the birds in the range area, and what he saw was worth saying. Gerald Cutler was there. He looked at Voss. He said, "The commercial operations are going to supply the November market. That's not going to change." Voss picked up his bag from the counter. He said, "2 of the largest operations in the county north are running late on processing. It's in the September extension newsletter." He paused for a moment. "I said something very similar in October of 1979. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and said without turning, "I was wrong then too." He left. Gerald Cutler stood at the counter and said nothing. Arvid Pruitt poured himself coffee and found something to do on the far side of the counter. The feed store was quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before Voss spoke. Gerald drove home on the county road past the Marsh place without stopping and without slowing down. He looked at the range fence and the birds visible behind it and the brooding house beyond them and the windbreak on the northwest corner standing solid in the October light. He drove past and did not stop. He did not mention the Des Moines investor again that month or the month after. November 8th fell on a Friday. Eleanor was in the barn checking the waterline connection on the North Trough when her phone rang. An unfamiliar number. She answered it with her work gloves still on. The caller was the event coordinator for a corporate Thanksgiving dinner being held at a conference facility in the county seat on November the 20th. She had heard about Eleanor's operation from Patrice Ellerman at Harlan Events, who had mentioned it during a conversation about local sourcing options in the county. The coordinator needed 12 birds, specifically 12 for a plated dinner format, at a weight between 14 and 17 pounds. Fresh, not frozen. Delivered no later than November 18th. Eleanor unfolded the notebook page she kept in her coat pocket. She had 29 birds unplaced that morning. Of those, she had 11 in the 14 to 17 pound weight class she was projecting. She said, "I can offer 12 birds in that weight range. Fresh delivery by the 17th. The coordinator said, "What's the price?" Eleanor told her, the same price she had given every buyer since August. The coordinator said she would need to confirm with her client. Eleanor said she would hold the allocation until the following morning. The coordinator called back at 4 that afternoon. Eleanor wrote November 8th. Corporate Thanksgiving event county seat. 12 birds. Via Ellerman referral. Total placed 121. 18 remaining. 18 birds. 18 buyers still needed. On November the 10th, 2 calls came within 40 minutes of each other. The first was a family she did not know, referred by the buyer at Harlan Fresh Market, who had told Eleanor when they spoke in September that his allocation would likely sell out early and that he would send remaining customers to her directly. 4 families. 8 birds confirmed in a single morning. The second call was from the owner of a bed and breakfast 20 miles east of town who had read a brief post about Eleanor's operation on a regional food sourcing network she had not known existed. The owner wanted 4 birds for the guest. Thanksgiving dinner she ran each year and had been trying to find fresh local birds for 3 consecutive Thanksgivings without success. 4 birds placed. Eleanor wrote November the 10th. Total placed 133 birds. 6 remaining. 6 birds. She called the Kettridge family that afternoon and told them she had birds remaining beyond their original order. Margaret Kettridge knew 2 families immediately and gave Eleanor the numbers without being asked. Eleanor called both. Both confirmed 2 birds each. 2 remaining. The last 2 required 3 phone calls on the morning of November 11th. On the 3rd call, a neighbor 2 townships over who raised hogs and whom Eleanor knew from the County Agricultural Association. The man said he had been meaning to ask her ever since he'd heard about her operation from a neighbor of his. His wife had been after him for years to find a proper local turkey for Thanksgiving. Could he still get one? Eleanor said, "I have 2 left." He said, "I'll take them both." She wrote November 11th. Final placement. 2 birds, Halverson family. Total placed 137 birds. 0 remaining. She put the pen down. She sat at the kitchen table in the Friday morning light and looked at that number. 0 remaining. 137 birds, every one of them placed at the price she had established in February and held through every conversation since August. She had projected in February that the margin would justify the timeline if the 3 conditions held. The 3 conditions had held. She did not call anyone. She did not go to the feed store or the diner or tell Nora Deming over the fence. She went to the range and did the morning walk because the birds still needed the morning walk, and the morning walk was on the list, and the list did not stop for the completion of its own items. She walked the range in the November morning and counted what she had 137 broad-breasted bronze turkeys at 22 weeks. Every one of them placed, every processing date confirmed, every delivery scheduled. The windbreak stood solid on the northwest corner. The range grass was flattened by the season but holding. The fence was intact on all 4 sides. She had been reading toward this morning since February. She went back inside and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the 23rd notebook and did not write anything for a few minutes. Then she opened it to the November section and wrote November 11th. All 137 birds placed, 0 remaining. Every bird at my price. Processing confirmed since May 6th. The gap was real. Howard's analysis holds. She closed the notebook. She went back to work. The crisis came from an unexpected direction on the 13th. She was at the kitchen table with the delivery schedule. She had been building the routing for the processing days and the 2 days of deliveries that would follow when her phone rang. She recognized the number Elm and Stone. She had not expected to hear from them before the delivery date. The chef's voice, when he spoke, had a different quality from the 2 previous conversations. More careful, the particular tone of a professional who has something to say that is not easy to say. He said, "Mrs. Marsh, I want to be straightforward with you." She said, "Go ahead." He said, "In September, I signed a supplementary contract with a larger regional supplier. They offered a volume we needed and a price that was lower than what we discussed in August." A pause. "Their November processing was just rescheduled. They can't deliver until December 3rd. Eleanor was quiet. He said, "I am calling because I want to know if you still have birds available. I understand if the answer is no or if the terms have changed." She looked at the notebook. 137 birds placed. 0 remaining. 18 of those birds had been placed at Elm and Stone in August. If she pulled the Elm and Stone allocation, which she was not contractually obligated to maintain, she would have 18 birds unplaced with 5 days until processing. She thought for 4 seconds. She said, "I have your 18 birds, mister. They were placed in August, and they have remained placed since August." He said, "The price you quoted in August." She said, "Yes, the price I quoted in August, which was not the commercial price." Another pause. Longer. He said, "I understand. And I want you to know that I understand why that's the right answer." He said it with the particular humility of a person who has made a decision that looked sensible at the time and has since been shown its full cost. "I should not have signed the supplementary contract," she said. "You were making the decision that looked correct in September, the same decision most buyers in this region made." He said, "The decision you didn't make in May." She said, "The decision I made in May was based on information that was available in May. Anyone who read the same sources I read could have made the same decision." He said, "I didn't read them the same way." She said no. He said, "I'll send someone for the birds on the 19th, fresh pickup as we agreed." She said, "I'll have them ready." She closed the phone and opened the notebook and wrote November 13th. Elm and Stone called. Their supplementary supplier failed processing, rescheduled to December. They are holding to the August booking at the August price. 18 birds confirmed at original terms. This is the gap closing exactly as Howard described it in 1979. The position you take in March is the position you hold in November. She underlined the last sentence. Then she went back to the delivery schedule because the routing still needed to be worked out and the 19th was 6 days away. November 19th was a Tuesday, and Eleanor loaded the birds before dawn. The loading process required the transfer crates from April and the same methodical movement through the range she had used, then working carefully, unhurriedly, the way she worked through any process that required precision and could not be hurried without consequence. Nora Deming arrived at 7 without being asked which was the right kind of help at the right time, and they finished the loading together by 8:15. Eleanor drove to Silas Boone's facility with the birds in the trailer. The morning was clear and cold, the Iowa cold of late November that had decided what it was and was not going to be argued with. The county roads were empty at that hour. The fields on both sides of the drive ran flat and bare to the tree lines harvested weeks ago, waiting for winter. Silas came out to the lot when Eleanor pulled in. He was in his work clothes and his boots, and he had the expression of a man whose day had already been running for several hours and would run for several more, and who was at peace with this because it was the nature of the work and the work was what he did. He looked at the birds as they came off the trailer. He said, "Good birds." Eleanor said yes. He said, "Broad-breasted bronze, March start." Not a question. She said, "March 14th. He looked at the birds moving into the holding area. He said, "Your father brought birds here 4 times. The last time was 2001. He paused. His birds always came in like this. Eleanor said, "He wrote down what produced them." Silas said, "It shows in the birds." She stayed for the first full day of processing the way her father had written. She should stay so you can see what you have and account for it, and so the processor understands that you are paying attention. Silas Boone's crew was efficient and careful in the way of people who have done skilled work long enough that the skill has become the work itself, no longer distinguishable from it. The processing was clean. The line moved at pace. The birds dressed well. The weights came in inside the ranges Eleanor had projected from her father's records for bronze birds at 22 weeks on full range, not the wider variance of less consistent programs, but the narrower distribution of birds that had been given the same conditions from the beginning and had developed along the same trajectory throughout. The mid-range weights were exactly what Harlan Fresh Market needed. The large weights were what the catering operations had ordered. The distribution was what she had planned for in February, built from her father's records of what 22 weeks of this program produced. She loaded the dressed birds into the 6 coolers she had borrowed from the county co-op's equipment lending program, organized by weight class and buyer labeled with the delivery information she had prepared the previous evening. Each buyer's birds together, each cooler marked. She drove the first delivery that evening. The chef at Elm and Stone came out to the parking lot when she pulled in. He was in his kitchen clothes, a towel over his shoulder, and he looked at the birds she had brought with the specific attention of someone verifying that what has been described is what has been delivered. He opened one of the coolers and looked at the top bird for a moment. He said, "These are going to be very good." She said, "Yes." He said, "I'll be calling you in the spring." She said, "I'll be available." He did not say anything more about the September decision or the supplementary supplier or the price he was paying that was not the commercial price. He received the birds and signed the delivery receipt, and that was the end of it. Eleanor drove to the next delivery, the catering delivery. The following morning, Patrice Ellerman met her at the loading dock and moved through the inspection quickly and professionally, the way someone moves through a process they have done many times and have learned to do efficiently. She said at the end, "Same time next year." Eleanor said, "If the conditions are right." Patrice looked at her. She said, "What conditions?" Eleanor said, "I'll know in February. The hotel delivery, the corporate event delivery, the family deliveries, the Kettridge family first because she knew them best and they were closest, and then the referrals outward from the Kettridge family, and then the families from the Harlan Fresh Market overflow. And finally the Halverson family, 2 townships over, where the man came out in his barn coat to help unload and said his wife had been asking him for a proper local turkey for years, and he was glad he had finally made the call. Eleanor drove home on the evening of November the 21st, with the coolers empty and the truck light and the county roads dark in the particular way they are dark in Iowa. In November, completely without interruption, just the road and the fields and the headlights finding the way forward. She did the final accounting at the kitchen table that night. She wrote every number in the 23rd notebook in the way her father had written numbers, without rounding, without adjustment, without the kind of editing that makes a result look better than it was or softer than it was. Feed costs across the full season week by week. Processing costs, delivery costs, revenue from each confirmed sale at the price she had established and held. The margin was what she had projected in February. Not approximately, not close. What she had projected. She looked at the number for a long moment. Then she wrote, "Season complete. Revenue matches." February projection to within 2%. The 3 conditions held. The gap was real. Howard's analysis of 1979 applies to this year. The position taken in March was the correct position. She closed the notebook. The Thursday of Thanksgiving week, Eleanor went to the diner on the main street of town. She went most Thursdays, and she went this Thursday because good seasons and bad seasons were both things that happened, and the appropriate response to both was to keep going. She ordered coffee and eggs and sat at the table by the window and read the county paper and watched the street outside where the morning was doing what mornings do in a small Iowa town in November, without drama, without event, at the comfortable pace of a place that knows what it is. Gerald Cutler came in at 8:30. He saw her from the door and walked directly to her table. He stood beside it for a moment, and she looked up from the paper, and then he sat down across from her without asking. He set his coffee cup on the table and looked at it, and then looked at her. He said, "I heard you sold out." She said, "Yes." He said, "Every bird." She said, 137 processed and sold. 6 losses before June 2 from the lamp failure in May, 1 from failure to thrive, 2 from a predation event in July, 1 additional removal in June. Gerald was quiet for a moment. He said, "At the price you were asking." She said, "At the price the market required." He looked at his coffee. Outside, a truck moved past on the main street. He said, "The Reinhardt operation in Calhoun County. They were one of the 2 large operations that couldn't get their November processing done." She said, "I know." He said, "They were selling birds at the gate in October. Couldn't get a processing slot." She said, "The slots were full." He said, "Full since when?" She said, "Boone told me his schedule was 90% committed when I called in April to ask about availability. I booked my dates on May 6th. He looked at her. He said, "May 6th. She said, "Yes." He turned his coffee cup on the table. He said, "I've been reading the same extension newsletters you've been reading for 30 years. She said, "I know." He said, "I didn't read them the same way." She said, "No." He was quiet for a longer moment. Then he said, "Your father, Howard, he used to say something at the elevator years ago. Someone asked him how he always seemed to be a step ahead of things, and he said he read the calendar differently from other people." Eleanor looked at him. He said, "I remembered it when you drove home from the auction in March. I thought about it more than once through the summer." He paused. "I couldn't figure out what he meant. I thought it was something people say, a way of seeming wise," Eleanor said. "He meant it literally. He didn't take the calendar as a fixed document, as an instruction to follow. He read it as a description of what usually happens, and then he read what was behind it, why it existed, what it was designed for, and when it failed to do what it was designed for." Gerald said, "And this year it failed." She said, "For the operations that followed it, yes. For me, no, because I wasn't following it." He said, "Because you were in March what they needed in November." She said, "Because my father taught me what to look for in March so I could be ready in November." He was quiet again. He drank his coffee. He looked out the window at the street. Then he said, "I was talking to that man from Des Moines about your South 50. She said, "I know." He said, "I thought I was helping. I thought the birds weren't going to sell, and you'd need the capital, and you'd want someone who had already found a buyer." He looked at the table. "I was wrong about all of it." She said, "You were working from the calendar, Gerald. The calendar said a March start was wrong. The calendar said the commercial operations would supply the November market. You were right, that those were the things the calendar said." He said, "But the calendar was wrong." She said, "The calendar was right about most years. It was wrong about this one. My father spent 22 years learning to tell the difference." Gerald nodded slowly. He set his cup down. He said, "The South 50. She said, "Is not available. It was not available in March, and it is not available now." He said, "I know that now." There was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who have been on opposite sides of a question for 8 months and have arrived finally at the same answer and are taking a moment to adjust to being in the same place. Gerald said, "When are you going to do it again?" She said, "When the conditions are right." He said, "How will you know?" She said, "I'll read the notebooks in January. I'll read them in February. I'll look for the year that most resembles the coming year. If the 3 conditions are present, I'll be at the auction in March. If they're not, I'll wait." He said, "What if they're never right again?" She said, "Then I'll have learned something from the years I waited. The same way my father learned something from the years he waited. The records are the record of both kinds of years." He sat with that. Then he put on his hat and stood up and said, "He was a good man, your father." She said, "He was a careful one. The good part came from that." Gerald walked to the door and out into the November morning. She watched him cross the street through the diner window and get in his truck and drive north on the county road toward his 300 acres of corn and soybeans, toward the operation he had run for 37 years by following the calendar as it was written. He had not apologized. He had not needed to. He had come to the table and sat down and said what was true, and that was its own kind of resolution. Eleanor finished her coffee. She paid at the counter and walked to her truck and drove home on the county road past the fields and the grain bins and the tree line along Harlan Creek and down the marsh driveway, past the brooding house, which was already empty and clean for winter. She had lime-washed the floor the week before. She had cleared the straw and stored the lamps and drained the water lines. The brooding circles were folded and stored in the barn rafters where her father had stored them, where she had found them in March, where they would be in the spring. She went to the study and sat at the desk. The wooden box was on the shelf to the left of the window where it had always been. Turkey records. Keep in her father's careful block letters across the lid. She lifted the box and set it on the desk and opened it. 22 notebooks in Howard Marsh's handwriting. 42 years of observation from 1959 to 2001. Every first frost date, every feed consumption figure, every mortality number with its cause, every market condition he had identified, and every outcome he had documented, and every year that had resembled another year, and every year that had not. Every mistake he had made and what he had learned from it. Every time the calendar had failed and what he had done about it. The record of a man who had understood that the future was not unknowable, only unread. She took the 23rd notebook from the desk and opened it to the final page of the season's record. She looked at the numbers one last time. 150 poults acquired on March 14th. 11 losses across the season. 7.3% against her father's full season average of 13%. 139 at processing. 137 sold at the price she had established in February, and held without exception through every conversation from August to November. Revenue, cost, margin. The margin was what she had projected. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at the 22 notebooks in the box and at the 1979 notebook on top. The one she had read 4 times in 2 years. The one that had given her the framework for everything that followed. She placed the 23rd notebook beside the 1979 notebook on the desk. The two of them opened side by side in the lamplight of the study. Her father's handwriting and her own. His year and her year. Different numbers, different buyers, different specific failures and recoveries, the same structure underneath. The same reading of the same conditions. The same position taken in March for a November that would not arrive for 8 months, held through the lamp failure and the predation event and the lost restaurant contract and the long, uncertain weeks of October when the market had not yet confirmed what she had projected it would do. She picked up the pen. She wrote the final line in the 23rd notebook. He taught me to read November from March. This year I did. She closed the notebook. She placed it in the wooden box beside the 22 her father had filled. The lid closed over all 23, with the fit of a thing carefully made to last. She put the box back on the shelf. She turned off the study lamp. Outside, the brooding house stood empty in the late November dark. Its south-facing walls invisible now in the absence of light, holding the cold of an Iowa winter that had no ambiguity in it. The range fence ran straight along the south field. The windbreak on the northwest corner was a dark mass against a darker sky. The white pines Howard Marsh had planted in 1971 for birds that no longer lived on this farm, for a purpose that had outlasted the man who planted them by 23 years and would outlast the woman who had inherited them by however many years she had left to work this ground. It would be ready in the spring, not necessarily March. That depended on the conditions. She would read the notebooks in January, the way she had read them this year, slowly against the current year's data, looking for the pattern, looking for the year that most resembled the coming year, looking for the position the calendar would leave open for the producer who was reading what was behind it rather than what was written on its face. She might find it. She might not. Her father had found it 4 times in 22 years. 3 of those 4 times he had been right. Once he had been wrong, and he had written down what he had missed, and he had been right the 3 times after that. The record was in the box. The box was on the shelf. She would read it in January.